All right, welcome to kind of the submodule for motivating readers. This is the Dylan O'Brien chapter in best practices in adolescent literacy instruction. And so I'm going to kind of lead a little like talk and then stop, like turn and talk kind of activity. Since this is going to be on a discussion thread, I'm actually going to make my own threads, and I'll tell you where to kind of put some of your responses in the thread, so it'll kind of look like a gallery walk. If I had poster boards in the classroom, like a gallery walk where you'd have post-it notes and then you go around and kind of like put your own comments. So I'll kind of do that, but with discussion threads. So it'll be kind of like a gallery discussion thread, I guess, is kind of the best way I can mush fake this activity. So let's get started on kind of like, well, motivating readers, which is like, if you can figure this out, you're going to solve 80% of maybe some of the issues you have with students enjoying your teaching. So let's do a deep dive into motivating readers. And so let's get all right, so we're going to do writing in the day. This is actually, I just want to kind of like foreground what this activity is kind of called. It's called using writing to learn kind of activity. So it's just like using writing as a cognitive tool to kind of organize thinking. And so we're gonna do this about a quote from the O'Brien and Dylan chapter. And this is the quote. So the deficit, referring to the deficit model, the deficit perspective ignores or subordinates most of the affective and identity construction dimensions of reading, which from a contemporary perspective include a range of both socio-cognitive and sociocultural aspects of motivation. So I want you to kind of think and unpack this paragraph. There's a lot going on here, and it's one sentence, but there's a lot here that they're kind of they're stating a claim, and then they're also kind of asserting kind of what their alternate view would be. So what do you think O'Brien and Dylan might mean by this statement? And if you're struggling, if you're like, I don't know, have no idea what they're talking about, sociocognitive, socioculture, I don't know, then ask some questions. So I'm going to have a thread called Writing to Learn, and you'll post this here, and post your responses here. So I'll let you stop and write, and think and write for about 6.5, 7 minutes. So time yourself, see if you can stay just kind of developing that stamina for writing, about 6.5, 7 minutes, and writing on the statement or asking questions about the statement. So pause the video and write and come back. All right. So when I'm doing this face to face, I'm also kind of modeling how you might want to do a lesson. So if you were teaching in front of class, and a lot of teachers will kind of write out learning objectives. Either I would put them on the whiteboard. I think I would probably change these learning objectives now. I like the I can statements, so having I can statements written on the whiteboard or the chalkboard, like so by the end of the class you'll be able to do the following. So I'd probably do, you can write and participate in a whole class discussion on differentiating between intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. Next learning objective that you will be able to do. So you can say, I can discuss with my peers the misconceptions of motivation and discuss with them how to better develop motivation with our future students. And then finally, I can discuss with peers how our students will be able to identify one in-class application of the Guthrie-Wigfield motivational framework for each frame. So we're going to really do a deep dive into this framework, because it's kind of there's 3 frameworks presented in this chapter. This one is kind of one of the easiest ones to wrap your head around, because there's like 3 essential questions that we could ask as teachers, but that students ask. Excuse me. All right, so let's theme. So those are learning objectives. So by the end of this lesson and this participation on your discussion thread, you will be able to do all 3 of these, or you should be able to. All right, so quick write. So formative assessment. I'm going to have a thread on extrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation, intrinsic motivation. So I want you to note the differences between the two concepts, and you're going to share them in kind of a quick write format. So this is just a quick write, and then we do a pair share kind of activity if this was face to face. So I'm going to have a little thread called extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation, and I want you to just kind of share, your 2-minute kind of writing sample from explaining the differences between the two. All right, and we'll move on to the next slide. So you've done this, and we're going to do a think, pair, share, which is going to be done on a discussion thread. So the misconceptions on table 3, which misconceptions of motivation did you hold before reading this chapter? What is surprising about this table? And then review why motivation is important to adolescent section. So this is going to be a thread on the table 3.1 and why motivation is important. So basically what I want you to do is just write up a quick kind of conversation with this thread. So it's going to be, I'm guiding the threads on this, so you're not creating your own thread on this discussion. So and then also make sure you answer, in what ways does identity formation and perceptions of competence influence motivation? So students' own perceptions of their competence influence how they are motivated to do things, and how does this motivation change as younger kids develop into adolescence? So think about how that kind of identity formation and their perceptions of how, do they have a fixed mindset, or do they have a growth mindset, and how that might cause problems or help them to become more resilient learners as they move into adolescence. And I want you to share on that thread. So this will be on the why motivation is important to adolescence thread. All right, next thread. So I'm just going to do some kind of front-loading lecturing, kind of like understanding reading levels. And we'll do a deeper dive on kind of reading levels when we get into 3046. But this is a good way to kind of like guesstimate. We want to know where our students are when they come in first day of class. Where are they kind of roughly at reading a grade level text from your content area? And so this is kind of a quick and easy way to do a quick kind of reading inventory on kind of assessing where they're at in their reading at the grade level. So on the left-hand side is kind of the 3 main reading levels that we as teachers need to kind of know where our students are at, because then we need to pick texts that can fit all this, and then what kind of scaffold. So there's 3 different reading levels, and we want to be able to support all 3 in our classroom. So independent reading, instructional reading, and frustration reading. Now, we want high complex text in our classroom. So if it's frustrating reading level, we're going to say, my students, we're not going to do that deficit model where I say, my students can't read this. I brought in like graduate level text with my 9th graders, and I scaffolded it to where they could get the gist of some really complex ideas that I was trying to get across. But you just can't hand students a text that's at that frustrating reading level and expect that they're going to do the reading on their own by themselves, because it's not going to happen. They're going to want to throw the book out the window because it's frustrating, right? If you ever tried to read a frustrating text, you get through half a page and you're like, what the heck's going on? And then you're finally tossing it out. So I have that feeling. I like reading philosophy, and I read a lot of continental philosophy, but it is frustrating for me to read, and it takes a lot of kind of energy to focus for just like 4 or 5 pages of just kind of reading that. But I have to read really slow, and I have to really kind of do a lot of metacognitive kind of monitoring of my comprehension, and when I'm reading those type of text. Now, so this is something, if you did if they were to read this text out loud to you, so you could do kind of like informal, you'd see a lot of this in like elementary schools where a teacher pulls students aside and they do a quick kind of reading of a text, and the teacher's kind of marking down, accuracy. But then there's also comprehension questions at the end, and the comprehension questions there has to be some inference questions, so it can't be just all questions that are yes, no, or right there in the text. It needs to be the questions need to be kind of broader and kind of thinking skills wise. So if a student is able to read 95% of the words correctly, and then have 100% comprehension on the questions, then that text is at their reading level. And so you don't need to provide any scaffold to support their reading. Right? Because so you're going to go read The Hunger Games, and they're able to do it, and they don't need a scaffold. I'm trying to think of YA Lit, because YA Lit's typically kind of an easier readability, so I would be more comfortable assigning kind of YA books that are written for a YA Lit audience, because the text complexity is a little bit less complex. So I'd be more comfortable sending kids home reading that stuff on their own without me having to do much scaffolding to give to them. And if you understand this reading level, you're going to solve a lot of problems. So my students, they have to do this reading at home, but they won't do it, and or they just don't do it, or don't want to do it. Well, there's some questions I would ask teachers to say that. It's like, what reading level are your students, and what's the reading level of the text that you're giving them? Because it could be something is either at their instructional level or at their frustrating level. And either one should not be really sent home for independent practice as homework, because you're limited on what type of scaffold supports that you can provide the student to be able to be successfully complete that reading. So, which means even instructional reading, which is 95% word accuracy and then 80% comprehension. And so even texts like that, which are typically your textbook in your content area, your textbook is generally going to be at that grade level of the student. So even the textbook is at the instructional level, meaning you need, as the teacher, to scaffold that reading to support their understanding of it. So even textbooks are not ideal to give to students to go home and read on their own without some type of scaffolding to support their understanding of the text. Okay? And then finally, frustration, which is under 90%, and they're lower than 70%. So this is a guesstimation. And so you will definitely not send students home with a frustration reading level of text, but you are going to bring in complex text in your class. And if you saw my kind of text set sample that I'm working with my Red Dragon, some of those texts are kind of would be frustrating. I could see myself doing a similar text set for like ninth graders, but I would have to probably scaffold a lot of those texts even more just to get my ninth graders to kind of get an understanding of it. So, and then scaffolding. So in the instructional reading, if you're doing textbook work, you're going to want to do guided reading in the classroom. So do guided reading activities with the students. A lot of guided reading activities are similar to like jigsaw activities that I try to do online in the online discussion, but I do jigsaws pretty much all the time, and I'm teaching face-to-face because research has shown jigsaw is probably the go-to method to really do a good guided reading and support students' learning of instructional reading text. And then so putting them in peer reading groups, so that would be kind of the jigsaw reading type of activities that the teacher could then support just reading the textbook in your classroom. Now, when I taught my kind of big idea units with my ninth graders, I did have I brought in philosophy, I brought in kind of a more difficult kind of histories on, say, my genocide unit on the Rwanda genocide and kind of how European colonialism kind of constructed these kind of groups of people in Rwanda to just arbitrarily, so socially constructed by Belgian kind of colonialism. And it's a difficult text. So I didn't say, oh, my students can't read that. They need to be exposed to complex writing, complex thinking, complex thought. but it's not. But I don't want to frustrate them. I don't want them to like hate this. So you, as the teacher, need to do a lot of support of the reading. So I would do all of difficult text. I would do a teacher read aloud, and then I would do interactive read aloud. So teacher read aloud needs to be planned. So you need to like, all right, I'm going to read these pages for today, and I'm going to have little post-it notes with like where I'm going to stop and think and ask questions and do kind of metacognitive kind of think out louds, showing students the metacognition of what readers do. But also, I'm going to teach my students to be able to interact with me while I'm reading, so they're allowed to like stop me. I have a question. What does this mean? Or stop. I'm making a connection to this other text we read. So that's what an interactive read aloud. So you really do a lot of the reading support when you have a frustrating text in your class. You're not going to not teach the frustrating class. You're going to teach the frustrating text. You are just going to do the heavy lifting of getting students up that really steep climb on that frustrating text. Hopefully that makes sense. So this is kind of why we need to understand reading levels. And once we kind of get this you start using these reading levels when you're thinking about what type of text you're going to use in your classroom and why, then you're going to start thinking about what type of scaffolding activities I'm going to do to support my students' understanding of the text. And you're going to have, targeted, my students would be reading 3 texts throughout my term, and one would always try to be at their independent reading level. So it was like a self-selected text, usually independent reading time, and it would be a text that if they were reading independently on their own and were able and not getting frustrated with like stopping or quitting, then that's the independent reading text. I would also pick, so with my Hero's Journey unit, I picked some texts that had lesser text complexity, so for literature circles. So I made sure students got to pick like one of 6 kind of books that kind of had the thematic kind of Hero's Journey aspect to it, but the reading level was, I carefully kind of looked at the reading level of each of these texts, and they were generally around the student's independent reading level. And then there was one which is the Odyssey, but it was called The Adventures of Ulysses, which is prose. It's not that kind of epic poetry, and it's simplified language, so it's a lot less complex in structure. I think it's written around a 7.5 grade level or 8th grade reading level, and then I have my 9th graders read it, which they were still having, they still had, I would say it was more at their instructional level, because a lot of the 9th graders I was working with were reading a few reading levels below that, but they seemed to not have too much problem. And then I'd have an instructional reading text where we would read together or read in groups, and then I would do the teacher read aloud with a more fresh. So Hero's Journey, I did Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. I was the one that read that out, and I did a lot of front loading activities. I had to show kind of what fall would look like or what winter would look like with leaves on the ground and stuff, because I had LA kids, and that just doesn't happen in LA. It's basically 75 and sunny 90% of the time in Los Angeles. So yeah, that's reading levels. So that's enough of me talking, because you're probably getting tired of that. So let's move on to the Guthrie Wakefield activity. So I'm going to have threads for each one of these questions. So the can I do this activity. So this is, I want you to go back through this section of the table and kind of the can I do this activity, because when you ask students to read or do anything, the first question that they're going to ask themselves is, can I do this? Is what the teacher asking me to do, can I do it? Do I have the self-efficacy? Do I believe in myself? Can I do it? Is it past my reading level? This is why you need to really pay attention to the text complexity of the text you choose. So you need to come up with an activity that supports students' efficacy in affirming their ability to read the text you choose. So there are some ideas in the chapter, so read through it, because you're going to post your idea of what you would do to get students to answer, yes, I can do this activity. So even before you read a test, you're trying to kind of get students self-affirming, yeah, I can do this activity, I can do it, because that's the first hurdle. If student answers yes, then we're going to move on to the next question. So we're going to have another thread, which is another question that student, all right, so I can do this. This is the secret sauce. do I want to do this activity and why? So, with me as a student in middle school and high school, I could do most of that stuff that teachers asked me to do. But the second question came around, I didn't really want to do it. They didn't connect to me or didn't kind of front load kind of like really big ideas with essential questions or any kind of get me curious or invested enough to want to do it. And so in this framework, in this section, I want you to brainstorm a possible support that will encourage your future students to want to do an activity. So you're thinking of a text or an activity, say one of your texts for your text set. Giving them sufficient, important, intrinsic motivated reasons for why. Okay? So you need to think of kind of how can I get my students to like, all right, I want to do what you're asking me to do, teacher. Okay? And doing reading for a grade is an intrinsic reward and does not offer the student to build motivation to become a self-reliant reader. So I'm also going to do a little meta here. I talk about this in my classroom. Like if you're not one, I'm making the assumption that all of you can do the readings that I ask you to do. Some are a little bit more difficult than others. I make the assumption that you want to do these readings because you want to be a teacher. So if you're like, I don't really want to do this, I would question me, do you really, really, really want to be an educator? That's kind of my argument. So I would say maybe if you're having this like, I don't really want to do this, if you feel like a heavy weight or a heavy burden, when you're trying to reading education text, then perhaps, because it means you're not, you need to know a lot about learning theory and how to kind of set up situations. And if you're not really invested in that, you just want to show up and tap dance and be the sage on the stage, well, you're going to be frustrated and you're going to want to leave the profession. And it's not, you want to be the sage on stage, go into theater and become an actor, that way you can do all that. But you can't act your way into being a teacher. It's not acting. So think about this, but find an activity that you want to get your students to kind of want to do your reading. And you're going to post it in the Do I Want to Do This Activity thread. All right, final question. So you got students, yes, I can do it, and yes, I want to do it. Can you get them to answer that they have an answer to what do I need to succeed? Do I have everything with me do I have all the tools available for me to succeed? And so again, this is my question with me. Do you have, as the readers, this is the final question, do you have all of that you succeed? Well, at SUNY Oneonta, we have a librarian, and student support services to help support students with kind of doing reading and writing of college level texts. And so there are supports there. Now, I encourage you to, if you don't know that there are supports there, you might want to investigate those supports to kind of get you. So this is the final question that you as teachers, though, do they have the tools to succeed? So if I assign a digital media project where they have to do video editing and they need access to the internet, I can't assume that they have those tools outside of school. Okay, they don't have the tools for them to be successful, so they're not going to do it. And it's like, so you need to make sure everything, all the pieces are there for them to be successful. All the students have access to that. Okay. So it could be, think of like how you could scaffold reading a text for either low instructional reading or frustrating levels to succeed. And there are ideas for this question. So again, go back to this section. I want you to find or think of an activity that would get students to say, yes, I have everything I need to be successful in doing this activity or project that you're asking me to do. And you're going to share it on our discussion thread. And if you're in class, we would do this on Post-it notes. All right, so next slide. Well, So this would be the section where you're going to go around in a gallery walk and kind of do your post-its. So just skip over here. I'm just kind of, this is how I would kind of do this. I'm not taking out the slide because I'm going to try to use this in the fall. So this is where you're going to now put all your post-its in the discussion thread. So all your ideas in the 3 discussion threads. All right, so next, synthesis. So I'm going to have a synthesis thread. So you're going to be posting to my threads, all of them, and then having a conversation with each other in each of these threads. So in the synthesis thread, I want you to synthesize the 3 motivational frameworks describing the chapter. So we kind of went through one, the Guthrie and Wigfield one, but there are 2 other ones. They're similar, but they are also different. And so I want you to synthesize. This is an important thing. We hear, a lot of students might hear or be able to read what synthesize means, but doing synthesis is a difficult cognitive task, right? So I want you to kind of synthesize. What do they have in similar? How are they different? What are the important aspects of all 3? And then how might we apply some of these frameworks to motivate our future students? Because if you can grasp some really important aspects of any of these 3, you're going to be very successful. You'll be much more successful than trying to tap dance your way to think you can be like a motivated speaker person and trying to motivate your students through kind of long-winded coachy speeches that you would see in like a sports movie or something like that. There are easier ways to do that than doing that, and you won't get your heart broken when you have this well thought out motivated speech and 70% of your class shrugs their shoulders. Yeah, try this. If you can do this, you'll be a little bit better. Maybe you'll get 80% the first time. Maybe you'll get 85%. You'll never get 100% of them. So I'm just going to spoil that right now. But if you do these right, you can get about 95% of your students to be somewhat invested in it. And there will be like the outliers, and you can't control all the myriad of covariants that go into motivating an adolescent's life and their motivations toward kind of wanting to be successful in your class. So, but if you get a good understanding, you'll be a much happier teacher. So really, I think this is probably, maybe one of the most important chapters for your education and career. Because if you can distill these into kind of developing lesson plans around, or tech sets on lesson plans or units around these aspects, your student teaching is going to go a lot smoother, your beginning teacher, and then you'll start kind of like modifying and changing these. Well, this stuff doesn't quite work for this population in my classroom, so I'll change it. And that makes sense. So you'll post your synthesis in the synthesis slide. And I believe, let me just check, make sure this, I may not have. No, we're doing this one. So we're doing struggling students. So let me fix this, because some of I redid the order of readings for this semester, so I kind of changed it up a little bit. So let's all right, slideshow from current slide, switch display. All right, so I fixed it, so it's now fixed in the slide that you'll have with this submodule. So I want you to read and prepare for discussion on the Compitore Lay Hall, Teaching Literacy to Youth who Struggle with Academic Literacies. It's the best practices in adolescent literacy instruction in Chapter 5 in the 3rd edition, and I'll create a submodule next, and a discussion activity, and a walkthrough video for that. So I'll see you there. Take care. Be well.